What role did the US play in obstructing justice here? And how has that contributed to the ongoing slaughter of journalists like Aysam Abdallah, Hussam Shobat, and Anas al-Sharif, who you mentioned more recently just this year?
So they're targeting journalists in Gaza, and they also have done this where they've targeted journalists, not saying that they're actually active militants, but they've defined them as combat propagandists. And so you've seen this just incredible devolution of Israel's approach to press freedom, where when Shireen was killed, they said, oh, we would never actually target a journalist knowingly to, well, those are journalists that are affiliated or aligned with Hamas. So therefore, we have every right to kill them.
Who was this person, your Aunt Shireen, and what do you miss the most about her?
So she was like the backbone of our family. The most thing I miss about her is talking to her, hearing her voice. Today, it doesn't matter if Shireen was an American citizen. For them, what matters is that she was Palestinian. And had she been murdered and killed somewhere in another part of the world, we would have not been having to do an entire movie to uncover who killed Shireen. We wouldn't have to be pleading for justice and accountability, because that would have happened from day one.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The Israeli military murdered an American journalist, covered it up, and the Biden administration refused to do anything for their own citizen. Shireen Abu Akleh, a trailblazing Palestinian journalist for Al Jazeera and a U.S. citizen, was shot in the head while clearly wearing a press vest during an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank in 2022. 3 years later, there's been no accountability. Instead, Israel has escalated its war on journalism. Today, I'm joined by two guests: Dion Nissenbaum, reporter, filmmaker, and executive producer of the powerful new Zateo documentary, Who Killed Shireen? And Lina Abu Akleh, Palestinian human rights advocate and Shireen's niece. We'll discuss the film, the murder, the killer, the cover-up, and the broader war on truth. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can always donate below on YouTube. Dion and Lina, welcome to Dispatches.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I really appreciate you two coming on. I'm glad that we could finally make this work. So let's just jump right into it because there's so much to talk about. And I'm going to throw the first question to you, Dion, because what's brought us together is you have produced this excellent documentary with Zateo, Who Killed Shireen.
That soldier looked down his scope and could see the blue vest and that it said press.
That's my belief, yes.
U.S. personnel have never had access to those who are believed to have committed those shootings.
No one has been held to account. Justice has not been served.
She is the first American Palestinian journalist who has been killed by Israeli forces.
I want to know, who killed Shireen?
How are we going to find the shooter? He's got a phone call set up with this Israeli soldier who was there that day. We just have to go over to Israel.
Did you ever talk to the guy who fired those shots?
Well, I know him personally. The U.S. should have actually come forward and actually pressed the fact that an American citizen was killed intentionally by IDF.
The drones are still ongoing. The explosion's going off.
Holy shit, we got a name.
911, 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911. 911.
But here's the twist.
And so I'm just wondering for our audience if you could maybe explain, I think a lot of people who watch this show know who Shireen Abu Akleh is, but maybe tell us who is like what happened to Shireen Abu Akleh, and then why did you decide to make a film about her?
Yeah, so Shireen was an icon in Middle East journalism world. She was, for people that don't know her, sort of the Christiane Amanpour of the Middle East. She was fearless. She was compassionate. She was documenting the occupation. She's Palestinian-American, and she spent her life and career documenting what was happening in Palestine. And in 2022, she went to cover a Israeli military operation in the West Bank city of Jenin, and she was shot and killed by an Israeli sniper while trying to approach this military unit. And her killing was sort of an inflection point for journalism and the Middle East. She's actually the first American journalist to be killed by the Israeli military ever. And what happened with her story was kind of like a case study in Israeli obfuscation about how they sort of blur the lines and create these clouds to cover up their culpability. And the documentary, on one level, it was personal for us. I did this with my colleague Fatima Abdul Karim, who's also a Palestinian journalist who is friends with Shireen. She went to the Al Jazeera office the day that she was shot and killed. She went to her funeral. We were both working for the Wall Street Journal at the time, and we watched, the coverage of her killing unfold, and we were completely frustrated with how Israel sort of was able to use this obfuscation to obscure their own culpability. And we set out to very clearly explain Israel's culpability and to track down the Israeli soldier who killed her, because Israel spent years hiding his identity, not just from the public, but from the American government. So we wanted to tell her story, and because she was such an important figure for journalists in the Middle East and the world, but also talk about it in the context of Israel and free press. And the reason we're here today talking about it is because you've seen this incredible deterioration of Israel's, commitment to the free press in Gaza, which I'm sure we'll get into over the next hour or so.
I mean, yeah, the timing is really important considering Israel has killed over 230 journalists in Gaza alone since October 2023. And Lina, I want to ask you before we get into some of the more specifics about Israel's disinformation campaign around Shireen's killing. Is you're a human rights advocate. You also work in journalism, and you're Shireen's niece, so this is very personal for you as well. And so I'm just curious, what was it like for you watching this film? 3 years after the murder of your aunt, what emotions come up when you see what's unfolded in Gaza and the West Bank since then, and then kind of revisiting how things unfolded after your aunt was killed?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the film did a really great job at unveiling and showing how the US administration, the previous US administration, led by Biden, did nothing to protect or to even get justice for their own citizen that was killed in another country by a foreign army. They completely ignored our pleas for justice, for an transparent investigation. So definitely it was emotional watching it and having to relive the trauma, but at the same time, it's such an important film that really shows that if they actually pursued justice and accountability, maybe more than 200 journalists wouldn't have been killed. It really shows that had there been justice for Shireen, had that soldier, that entire chain of command been held accountable, countless of lives would have been spared. So it's definitely heartbreaking to see that 3 years, nearly 3 years later, 3 years later, we still see journalists being murdered in Gaza. Journalists, Palestinian journalists who have been reporting day in, day out, while living through the genocide, are also are also being targeted. So it really is triggering, but at the same time, it shows just how this impunity that continues to be present.
Yeah, I mean, one thing the film does really well, as you mentioned, is show the complicity of the Biden administration. We can get to that, but first, I wanted to ask you, Diane, about the sort of disinformation playbook that we saw play out with Shireen's killing, and you show this really well in the film, and it's so jarring to watch because you're just kind of watching the same playbook play out over and over and over in what Israel's done in Gaza. So one thing that happens that you see in the film is the sort of um, like that playbook I mentioned, you see the denial first, right? The Israelis deny they had anything to do with it. They blame Palestinian militants for doing it. And then eventually they say it was, a tragedy. It was in the crossfire of a fight. It was an accident. And then, it kind of gets swept under the rug. No one ever pays. And the US takes its hands off, right? And you saw the same script play out, not just with the killing of journalists, at least in the beginning, but you saw the same script play out, for example, with the targeting of hospitals. Remember that first hospital Israel targeted, Al Ahli Hospital, way early in the genocide in Gaza? You saw the Israelis say, no, this was actually Islamic Jihad that did it. Oh, it was like an accident. And then eventually it just got swept under the rug. And then it became so normal to just target hospitals, everybody forgot about it. So I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about how that played out specifically after Shireen's murder and how important it is to understand that playbook because it keeps going and going today.
Yeah, that there were a lot of surprising revelations to us as we did the film that, you know, her story was very well covered at the time by Al Jazeera, New York Times, Washington Post, BBC. A lot of people did very thorough investigations showing that it was clear that an Israeli soldier likely killed her. But that was all. And also, the other thing that's really important here is that there were Palestinian journalists on the scene there that day who said from the very beginning that she was shot by an Israeli sniper. And those journalists' eyewitness testimonies were basically discredited and not taken seriously because they were Palestinian journalists. If there had been Western journalists there, it would have been a very different story on how it was framed. So from the beginning, as you said, the first thing that the Israeli prime minister himself did was put out a video showing some Palestinian militants shooting down an alley in Jenin and says our evidence shows that it was quite likely that Palestinian militants killed Shireen in this unfortunate incident. And a journalist went to the scene and showed very clearly that that alleyway was nowhere near where Shireen was. It couldn't have been possible that they killed her. And one of the most remarkable things to me in our film was that I was told by a top US official that a top Israeli general went to the US hours after her killing and said, you know what, we think it was probably us, but we're not sure. But they spent months and months denying culpability. And then they continued to suggest it was in a crossfire. And to me, again, this was also a maddening thing to me because the final Israeli military investigation shows that there was no crossfire. The Israeli military's own investigation shows there was nobody behind Shireen firing towards them, no one that the Israeli military was firing at. Their own Israeli military investigation showed that the soldier mistakenly identified her as a militant and intentionally shot her. And when I would talk to top US officials about this, years later, they still in their head would say like, "Oh, she was caught in the crossfire. It was an accident." And it wasn't at all. And so we wanted to document this. And again, like you said, you see this play out over and over again where Israel creates this cloud of misinformation to suggest that someone, is a militant. We can talk about Anas al-Sharif, the killing of the latest Al Jazeera journalist who was directly targeted in Gaza. Israel has provided no evidence that he was a militant, as they claim, but they put out these photographs of him, with the Hamas leader Sinwar to somehow suggest that he's a Hamas militant, and that has no bearing on whether or not he's actually an active Hamas militant. So you do see it playing out over and over again.
And then, Lina, I kind of wanted to throw the same question at you and add to it. I mean, as this was happening to your family, and then you're seeing the lies right afterwards. And so I'm just curious how that played out for you and your family. Because you knew what happened. Like Diane said, there's Palestinian journalists, eyewitnesses on the ground saying what happened. And meanwhile, you see Naftali Bennett, then prime minister, coming out and promoting these lies. And you see, I will say in this case, the media did do a good job of really pushing back against the Israelis, but still, Israeli spokespeople always get to go on TV. They always get to state their lies. They're good at it, right? They have a whole system in place. So yeah, what was that like for you and your family at the time?
I mean, to be honest, my family and I, we didn't really give in that much of a. We didn't care about what the Israelis were saying because we knew the truth. We believed the witnesses who were there. We saw the images, and even the journalist Shada Hanaisha, who was right next to Shireen when the moment she was targeted, she also tried to reach out to Shireen and try to help her to check on her, but she was still continuously being shot at. So for us, we really didn't care much about what the Israelis were saying because at the end of the day, we've seen how they continue to obfuscate the truth. We continue to see how they always try to get themselves to be out of the situation, and also as Diane had mentioned, from the first moment that they started releasing these multiple narratives, NGOs and organizations and news outlets started releasing footage showing the actual location of the incident and where it happened, and how it was, in fact, an Israeli soldier who was stationed few meters away from Shireen. And again, at the end of the day, Shireen was a journalist wearing her press vest. It was in broad daylight. And um, all the investigations showed that they were targeting her upper body. I mean, even her colleague Ali Samoudi was shot on his shoulder before Shireen was killed. So for us, we really at that moment we didn't care much for what they were saying. We did not expect anything from them, and we never even expected that they would hold any of their soldiers accountable for killing a journalist, because in the past we've seen how other journalists had been killed, but there was no sort of accountability. And this was a report published by the Committee to Protect Journalism in 2023, I believe, showing the continuous pattern of targeting journalists and how they've killed 22 journalists until then. So for us, at the end of the day, all we wanted was for there to be justice, and that's still something we keep calling out for.
You mentioned Shada. She is the first recipient of the Shireen Abu Akleh Endowed Memorial Scholarship at the American University of Beirut now. So shout out to her. And she's a wonderful person. But I want to take this to the issue of the U.S. Complicity in the lack of accountability for this murder. Because Shireen is Palestinian, but she's also an American citizen. Not that that means she's a more important person, but an American citizen was murdered intentionally, as this film shows, by a soldier that is armed by the Americans. And what's wild is, Diane, your film makes it clear that the Biden administration basically helped Israel get away with it. They classified their own report on Shireen's death and then refused to hold anyone accountable. So I'm curious if you can tell our audience What role did the US play in obstructing justice here? And how has that contributed to the ongoing slaughter of journalists like Isam Abdallah, who's Lebanese and was killed in South Lebanon in October of 2023 intentionally by the Israelis, as reports later showed. It was targeted with another group of journalists. He was a Reuters correspondent. And then other journalists such as Hussam Shobat and Anas al-Sharif, who you mentioned more recently just this year. And in the cases of those two journalists, the Israelis didn't even deny it. They actually celebrated and bragged about it afterwards.
Yeah, there's so many things to talk about with this. The most remarkable interview to me in the film is the one with this anonymous U.S. official who was directly involved in the U.S. response to her killing. And in the film, he tells us that the initial U.S. assessment of Shireen's killing was that she was intentionally targeted by the Israeli soldier, and that soldier should have been able to identify that she was wearing this press vest. So this is based on the U.S. investigation done right after her killing. And what happened was that assessment was essentially overruled by State Department officials, and when they put out their report and their assessment, they said the exact opposite. They said it was unintentional based on what the Israelis told them, that, oh, they didn't mean to kill a journalist. And that person came forward because he was so disgusted with how the Biden administration had responded to this when their own assessment was that she was intentionally targeted. And it basically just went downhill from there. So the initially, the State Department spokesperson Ned Price said after she was killed that the person who killed her should be prosecuted. They should be held to account. And then when it became clear that it was an Israeli soldier, then it became, well, there should be um, something should be done. It became very vague. And then they sort of went to talking about they wanted Israel to change the rules of engagement for how it operates in the West Bank, how they respond to these things. And even in that incident, even at that point, the Israelis basically rejected uh, the U.S. Request that they change their rules of engagement. And that's when you've seen, I think, 8 Americans that have been killed in the West Bank by the Israeli military and settlers since Shireen was killed, including a Turkish American activist, um, Aysenur Egi, who was also taking part in a peaceful protest. An Israeli soldier, also from about 200 meters away, fired and killed her when there was no one shooting at her. Their response in that case was that they were trying to shoot at somebody else, and the U.S. government accepted that as a legitimate rationale, that they were trying to shoot at another unarmed activist nearby. And as Lina said, you've seen the fact that the U.S. didn't hold Israel to account for Shireen's killing led Israel to this understanding that no one was going to hold them to account for killing an American journalist, so they could kill other Americans and other Palestinian journalists without being held to account. And you're seeing that to this day. They're now openly targeting journalists, Al Jazeera journalists, without any repercussions, any ramifications. And we feel like Shireen's killing was kind of an inflection point where Israel could see that they weren't going to face any accountability for doing these kinds of things.
I mean, it's really chilling. There's a line in the documentary where you actually say, if we don't answer, you say who killed Shireen, and if we don't answer this question, more journalists and civilians will be killed, and that is exactly what's happened to such a shocking degree, like nothing we've literally ever seen in our lifetimes. And it is going to continue as long as no one's held accountable. And to that end, I mean, what's really amazing about this documentary is that you are able to actually find the killer. And I mean, it's like, it's good investigative work, but it's like it was doable. is the point, is it was doable to find this person. You guys did it, something the US government was unwilling to do. And so can you talk a little bit about, who was the killer? Who did it? What happened to him?
Right. So this is the thing. In some ways, when we set out to do this documentary, nobody on my team, Mehdi Hassan, other people, nobody thought we would actually find the killer because it was such a closely held secret. My journalist friends in Israel didn't think we would find him, and we thought it would be a challenge, but in some ways it actually proved to be very easy because Israel is such a small country. Everybody knows everybody. And if you just do some journalism and you don't just sort of go to the Israeli military and ask them who it is, and you find other angles, we found the person. And he turned out, when he killed her, he was a 20-year-old Israeli soldier on his first deployment in the West Bank. His name was Alon Skagio, and he was a young sniper who himself was actually killed in Jenin last year in a separate, completely unrelated incident. He was killed by a roadside bomb by Palestinian militants who obviously didn't know that he was the person who killed Shireen. But we tracked down his family. I talked to his mother for this, as the film was coming out. But he was just a young soldier on his first combat deployment. He was quietly transferred to a different unit, sort of promoted up and out of the unit, because both the Israeli soldiers that we talked with and American military officials we spoke with said that he should not have taken this shot. So when we spoke to Israeli trainers, they had said, like, this guy should not have taken this shot. He was in an armored vehicle 200 yards away. He had plenty of time to determine if she was a threat. He could have taken plenty of time. There was no gunfire coming from her. So, he was basically, he should not have taken that shot. But instead of being disciplined, instead of having any ramifications, he was transferred to a different unit and allowed to continue on with his military career until he was killed last year.
Incredible, incredible. I wanted to ask you, Lina. Well, first off, I mean, Shireen is an American citizen. Obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with, probably your entire life, U.S. support for Israel and almost anything they do. That said, since she's an American citizen, were you and your family at all surprised by the U.S. participation in this cover up? As you witnessed it take place.
I remember during the first few days and months following her killing, I'm not gonna lie, I did have some hope that um, they will be supportive, that they're going to actually hold Israel to account, or hold the soldier to account, or bring any sort of justice to Shireen. And especially, but afterwards, I actually started realizing that this is going to be a long, long way. Because when we met with then Secretary Anthony Blinken, um, I felt when we went into the meeting, we came out with more questions than answers. And we asked him, how do you guarantee that this doesn't happen to any other American citizen? And he said, well, I can't guarantee you that. And the other thing that I remember he said was, we kept asking him, can you guarantee that the arms used to kill my aunt were not funded by her own tax dollars, or were not American? And he said, well, we don't know. I can't answer that. So since then, I started feeling like, you know what, this is not actually what we were anticipating. And even after that, when President Biden was in the region and he was visiting Jerusalem, he was in the West Bank. He was right where Shireen was born, right where she was raised, and he didn't even make any sort of effort to see our family or talk to us. But this goes back to the fact that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Shireen was an American citizen. For them, what matters is that she was Palestinian. And had she been murdered and killed somewhere other in another part of the world, we would have not been having to do an entire movie to uncover who killed Shireen. We wouldn't have to be pleading for justice and accountability because that would have happened from day one. So for us as a family, we were definitely surprised that we didn't get justice for Shireen yet. But at the same time, a part of me thought that it would have happened, but unfortunately, after the experience we had with the previous administration, it really showed the double standards and the hypocrisy within the previous administration and how they handled the murder of their own citizen.
Yeah, it's really stunning. And then I also wanted to ask you, once the killer was found, and what was your feeling on that? Just generally speaking, I imagine you weren't surprised by the background of this person, but yeah, tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I remember when I first found out who the killer was, I definitely was I don't know how to put it into words, but it felt like I was reliving May 11th. But at the same time, for me, it was important that we not only hold the soldier to account, but also the entire system, the commander, the unit, all the way up to the chain of command and to the state, because they're the ones who perpetuate this kind of violence and atrocities against Palestinians and journalists in this case. But I remember, like, even watching it and the irony that he was supposedly killed in Jenin was very it's so hard to put it into words because I remember when I first saw it and I heard it, I was in shock, but at the same time, I was upset. I was really upset that he didn't have to go to prison. He wasn't held accountable. He was just killed. So it's upsetting, it's frustrating, but at the same time, that doesn't put an end to our fight. On the contrary, we continue to have these kind of discussions. We continue to talk about Shireen. We continue to call for justice for all journalists and for the killing of Shireen. So it definitely gave me a push for me and my family.
One other thing that I think is emblematic of sort of the Israeli military approach to this that we were told by an Israeli soldier who was um, part of the Duvdevan unit, not the unit itself, but part of Duvdevan, which is this sort of revered unit in Israel. Netflix did this series called Fauda about Duvdevan. It's called Cherry. They're undercover guys that go into hospitals dressed as doctors and kill Palestinians in their hospital rooms. After Alon Skagia was killed, this member of Duvdevan told us that his comrades started using Shireen's photograph for target practice. And, that was to me, it's even still chilling to think about it because
Yeah.
it shows sort of the level of dehumanization that there is that continues on because she wasn't the enemy here. At the time, she wasn't the enemy. She was a journalist. She was wearing a press vest. She was trying to cover this. And they saw her as the enemy. And, the other thing that we've seen in the evolution of Israel's approach to press freedom is they have now banned Al Jazeera in Israel, and they say that it's now a mouthpiece for Hamas. And so you know, they now basically treat Al Jazeera journalists as Hamas and directly target them. So you've gone from a place with Shireen's killing where they said we would never knowingly target someone wearing a press vest to now what they say is, well, if you wear they actually say this, wearing a vest that says press does not mean that you are necessarily a journalist. It doesn't turn a terrorist into a journalist. So they're targeting journalists in Gaza, and they also have done this where they've targeted uh, journalists, not saying that they're actually active militants, but they've defined them as combat propagandists. And so you've seen this just incredible devolution of Israel's approach to press freedom, where when Shireen was killed, they said, oh, we would never actually target a journalist knowingly to, well, those are journalists that are affiliated or aligned with Hamas. So therefore, we have every right to kill them.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Like I said, it's gone from, like you said, denial to literally after Anas al-Sharif was killed, and the Israelis were inciting for him to be killed for months. They bragged about it immediately on Twitter. The Israeli military literally tweeted out like a little target emoji and struck as though they had taken out like Yahya Sinwar or something. It's really despicable. But I want to ask you about a person in particular who is featured in the film, and that's Ali Samoudi. You mentioned him already. He was with Shireen when she was killed. He was also shot in the shoulder. This veteran Palestinian journalist. I didn't even know this because there's been so much targeting of journalists by the Israelis. It's genuinely hard to keep up. But he was shot in the shoulder alongside Shireen that day. He survived. However, this April, he was detained by the Israelis and he's now being held in administrative detention and his health is deteriorating. There's supposed to be a hearing on September 4th.
يعطيك العافية علي. شكرا كتير إنه عم تلتقي معنا بعد هذا اليوم الطويل. Thank you very much for meeting us. We are set up here now, even though we were supposed to meet at the location where you got injured and Shireen got killed.
We are 5 minutes from the location in Meydan al-Awda, but you could lose your soul in the 5 minutes it would take us to reach it. You could be hit by army bullets. They could arrest you. So it is essentially impossible to get there. I believe the big disaster which prevented the occupation from being punished and repeating these crimes is the neglect and indifference by many of the institutions, especially American ones, which continue to defend the occupation.
We're now approaching the 3rd anniversary of Shireen's death. How did that affect you?
During that period, the occupation was making preparations for a dangerous scenario in the Jenin refugee camp. And for this reason, they didn't want witnesses. They opened fire on us in order to terrorize us enough that we wouldn't go back to the camp. And in that sense, they partially succeeded. Since then, we have been overcome by fear. From the moment Shireen was killed, I said and continued to say and will continue to say that this bullet was meant to prevent the Palestinian media from the documentation and exposure of the occupation's crimes.
So Dion, can you tell us what's going on with Ali Samoudi? And what does this case tell us about that broader Israeli war on journalism, even beyond Gaza? Because this happened in the West Bank.
Exactly, right. So the Israeli crackdown on press freedom extends to the West Bank and also, in fact, to Israel. The Israeli government boycotts Haaretz, the sort of left-leaning publication there. They won't deal with them because they're considered too, anti-government. But yeah, the crackdown on Palestinian journalists, in fact, does extend across the West Bank. And Ali Samoudi was, again, a veteran, seasoned journalist in Jenin. He was detained in his son's home in April, right before the film came out. And, what he says in the film is prophetic. He says that he believes that the bullets that injured him and killed Shireen was meant to send a chilling effect and silence Palestinian journalists from telling the story of what was happening to Palestinians under Israeli occupation. So they arrested him in April. They held him. He's being held without charge under administrative detention. The Israelis admitted that they have no public charges to hold him, and so they hold him under Israeli administrative detention, which allows them to hold him indefinitely without charging him. And there'll be a hearing in September. The Committee to Protect Journalists and others are calling for him to be freed. But what Israel does in these cases is they just renew the administrative detention for another 4 months. And yes, he's an elderly journalist. He's an elderly man. His health is deteriorating. His family is calling for him to, to be released. But he again is very emblematic of the Israeli approach to press freedom and Palestinian journalists. They arrest him. They throw up a cloud suggesting that he's somehow affiliated with militants. They don't actually provide any evidence. They just hold him until people forget about his story and other stories come up. And, even you who follows these things incredibly closely weren't even aware of his case because there's so many other individual cases happening that they just rack up, and you can't keep track of how many things are happening and the erosion of press freedom in this part of the world.
Dion, I wanted to ask you about your own history reporting in the Middle East because you've actually spent a significant amount of time in Gaza. You were there during the Israeli withdrawal way back in 2005. And then you were there during the election of Hamas and then the fight between Hamas and the PA. And you also witnessed the Israelis blocking Western journalists during Operation Cast Lead. I'm kind of just giving some of the background of your own career in this area, but I'm curious if you can maybe walk us through your own experience in Gaza, and then how do you reconcile what you witnessed over those 15, 20 years to what we're seeing happen now, which is the complete obliteration of the Gaza Strip?
Yeah, I was just going through some storage stuff and I found an old poster of Gaza from 2005 when the Israeli military pulled out. And it's these beautiful scenes of farmers and olive growers. And I really used to enjoy spending time in Gaza. It's on the Mediterranean. It's a small community. Everybody knows each other. It was incredibly friendly and opening, welcoming, and to have seen it go from sort of this hope and optimism when the Israelis left in 2005 to this complete destruction of Gaza. I have many friends from Gaza, most of whom left before this happened. It's a tragedy to watch, and I just can't imagine what the future looks like for Gaza after this. Israel has done so much to destroy, the basic foundations, the universities, the hospitals, the farmland, everything has just been decimated. It's hard to imagine how Gaza comes back from this. And one thing that you mentioned was that I was there in 2009 when Israel launched Operation Cast Lead. And at that time, this was 2009. And at that time, it was Christmas of 2009. And a bunch of us Western journalists were in Jerusalem. And Israel actually carried out a disinformation campaign at that time to say that they weren't going to go into Gaza, so that we all kind of stayed out. And it's like, oh, they're going to wait till after the holidays. And then they launched the military operation and they closed Gaza so that Western journalists couldn't get in again. This was again, 2009. And so what Israel has done now, keeping Western journalists out, goes back, decades. And we went down to the Rafah border in Egypt to try and get in. One sort of interesting factoid from this is that I was on the Egypt-Gaza border with a young Washington Post journalist named John Feiner.
Huh, that sounds familiar.
Who went on to be the deputy national security advisor to Joe Biden when all of this was unfolding. He and I went into Gaza together in a taxi when we were able to finally get in at the end of that operation and document what was happening there. And so, it was always interesting because I knew that, John knew what was happening in Gaza, and, I know, you know, that, he was in a position to try and affect real change, knowing the human cost that was happening there. And we didn't see him really have an impact there. And, it's a tragedy, I think, that.
Yeah. I mean, one could say, I'll say, it sounds like he was just following orders. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.